Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. So today I will be going over all the books that I read in the second half of August. This video is going to be so long, so I will have timestamps for you in the description box. I'm going to be dividing the books into genres. Before I talk about the books that I read, I'm just going to mention the books that I'm currently reading. I didn't get a chance to finish them this month, which is completely okay because I've read so much. First, we have Quartet in Autumn by Barbara Pym. I'm only a couple chapters into this, but I'm really enjoying it so far. The characters are very endearing, so I'm excited to continue reading it in September and hopefully finish it at the beginning of September. I'm also currently halfway through The Coming Storm by Regina Hansen. This is a YA kind of spooky book inspired by Anne of Green Gables, and like I said, I'm halfway through and I'm really enjoying it so far. I at first thought it was middle grade, but I definitely think it's YA. There are just some elements in the story that I think middle grade readers are a bit too young to read. But yeah, I'm really enjoying this, and we'll talk more about it once I have finished it. And I'm also reading The Old Curiosity Shop by Charles Dickens. I'm about a third of the way through this one, and it's been a struggle, but I will push through and I will definitely try to finish this in September. I do have a goal of reading all of Charles Dickens' books, which is why I have not DNF'd it. Otherwise, I probably would have DNF'd it, but this book, I have thoughts, but I'll share them in my September wrap up. All right, so on to my DNFs from August. First, we have Part of Your World, and this one I DNF'd because of the sexual content. I have heard that it's not as heavy in sexual content as other romance novels, but to me it was just too much, so I decided to put it down. I also DNF'd The Escape Room by Megan Golden. This book was just boring and I wasn't really getting invested in what was going on. I really struggle with thrillers and this one just isn't for me. This next DNF absolutely breaks my heart and I feel so guilty, but I had to DNF it, and that is The Memories We Painted by Caitlin Miller. I did receive this book as a gift from my amazing friend Bailey, and my heart just breaks. But this book just wasn't doing it for me. I really struggled to connect to the writing style and the characters. I'm getting much better at DNFing, and I'm trying not to feel guilty about DNFing, but this just wasn't for me. And my fourth and final DNF is Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray. I got to, I think, page 270 something. So I got a good chunk of the way through the book. Lord, this book. So this book is basically a satire. It is William Makepeace Thackeray making fun of British high-class society. This book is just full of unlikable characters that are all vain. The first few chapters were interesting because we were getting introduced to some of the characters, but then it just went downhill. I was so bored. This entire book is just following characters around as they are absorbed in their own vanity. And that's basically all that happens in the first third. I don't know about the rest of the book, but I'm not interested enough to continue. I was really bored. This book is way too long. I will say the writing is very accessible for a classic, so that was one positive thing about this book. It's quite an easy read, but I was so bored. So I decided not to continue pushing through, and I will probably be unhauling this. All right, so on to the books that I finished in the second half of the month. I'll try not to talk too much about each book because there are a lot. But like I said, there are timestamps if you want to skip certain genres that you're not interested in. But first I'll go over all the picture books that I finished. First we have Rapunzel by Paul Zelinsky. This book is very much a retelling of the classic fairy tale, and it is set in a world that feels very much like medieval or Renaissance Tuscany, Italy, which was really nice. You can see with these illustrations. And yeah, this was fun. I gave it 4 stars. It definitely made me feel nostalgic. And I do really like the original Rapunzel tale as well as retellings. And yeah, this was just really fun. Then we have Rumpelstiltskin. Same idea, very much feels like Renaissance Italy. And this one I actually read in elementary school. So this one was very nostalgic. I also gave it 4 stars. It was just so cute and definitely brought back a lot of childhood memories. 3 more picture books that I gave 4 stars. We first have Swan Lake, and this is based on the New York City Ballet. I read the New York City Ballet's Nutcracker picture book last Christmas and loved it. And this one was very cute. I love the illustrations, and it's a nice summary of the Swan Lake Ballet by Tchaikovsky. And yeah, just very pretty illustrations. And just overall a very fun picture book. We then have Mother Goose and Friends, and this is just full of nursery rhymes, and so many of them I remember from my childhood. And the illustrations in this were just beautiful. I absolutely love how whimsical they are. Just so much fun. This particular nursery rhyme, you'll actually hear me talking about it later on in the video because a book that I read actually features this nursery rhyme, which I found really interesting. So, but yeah, 4 stars, so much fun. And then we also have The Golden Mare, The Firebird, and The Magic Ring. This is based on Russian folklore and mythology, and it was so fun. This one also has really nice illustrations, and I love books set in Russia that are inspired by Russia, and yeah, just beautiful. And then I have 3 picture books that I gave 5 stars to. First, we have The Night Before Christmas. This is the traditional children's rhyme, and I was just in love. If you know anything about me, you know that I'm obsessed with Christmas. My heart was just so full. The nostalgia was just so strong. Loved this so much. Then we have Sleeping Beauty, and I read this as a kid in elementary school, and so reading it again just brought back those memories. And I remember the illustrations in this book being extremely whimsical and with lots of gold and almost like shimmery tints to it. I don't know how to explain it, but just a lot of gold and just such a whimsy to it. I was obsessed with this, and I love it just as much as I did as a child. My favorite picture book that I read this month is The Snow Princess. This is by Ruth Sanderson, and this is also inspired by Russian fairy tales. This one was beautiful. This is the kind of story that I would love to read as like an adult fantasy retelling of the story. I forget what the actual Russian fairy tale is, but I did read up on it a little bit, and it would make such a perfect fantasy retelling set in winter. I mean, just look at this. These illustrations just blew me away. I love winter. I love snow. This book was just, it's like it was made for me. All right, so the next category is Christian/historical. I do have one non-Christian historical fiction in this pile. And the first book that I read is Love and the Silver Lining by Tammy L. Gray, and I gave this book 5 stars. It's one of my favorite reads of August. It was beautiful. I loved this story so much. I can't believe I gave another contemporary 5 stars, but this book was just beautiful. I gave the first book in this trilogy 5 stars as well, and oh, this book, I loved it, I think even more. So this book is about a woman named Darcy, and she was supposed to be going on this missions trip to Guatemala. That got canceled because of financial reasons, and so she's kind of left emotionally reeling, and she's really struggling because she feels like now her life has no meaning, no purpose. She doesn't know what she's supposed to do. She feels like she has nothing to fall back on because she's quit her job. She's not able to live in the apartment she's been living in anymore. But then Darcy is offered a room in this girl's apartment, and she doesn't really know how she feels about this offer because she is not a fan of this girl's brother, Bryson. Bryson is the leader of this rock band, and Darcy's best friend Cameron is also in this band. So she knows Bryson but has never gone along with him. He seems to be a very grumpy and depressed and just unlikable person, and she really does not like Bryson at all. So Darcy's in this state of not knowing what to do with her life, but then she's offered a chance to work with dogs that are basically like rescue dogs. They don't have a home. Some of them have behavioral issues, and it's definitely a really difficult task, but Darcy just jumps at this chance because she loves animals. She's amazing with dogs, and this is where the story really captured my heart. When Darcy started working with these dogs, I was a mess. There were so many moments where I teared up. It was just such a beautiful story, and we really get to know Bryson as well as a character, and we get to understand him a lot more than what we would just see on the outside. And it's just a beautiful story of healing and growth and finding peace and fulfillment, and it was just a beautiful story, and I again loved it so much. It does deal with things like divorce and the feeling of abandonment, and it's very impactful. I loved this book so much. Next, we have a book that I reread, and I'm so glad that I did. It was just as beautiful as the first time I read it a few years ago, and that is Counted with the Stars by Connelyn Cassette. This is her debut in the Out from Egypt series, and this book, it is not a perfect book, but to me, it just holds nostalgic value. It's one of the first biblical fictions that really, really made me fall in love with the biblical fiction genre. This is about a girl named Kaya, and she is basically sold by her father, who is a, I guess, middle-class Egyptian citizen. But she's sold by him because he has lost a lot of money. And so she's sold into this household, and the mistress of the house is terrible. She is awful to Kaya. It's in this house that Kaya meets a Hebrew slave, and she learns about Moses, and she learns that Moses has been going to Pharaoh demanding that he lets the Israelites go. This is set during the Exodus era, I guess, of the Bible. And so she's learning about Moses, she's learning about the Hebrew God, and then the plagues start happening. And then when Pharaoh releases the Israelites, Kaya flees with them, and then the story goes from there. This is such a beautiful story of faith and discovering who God is and his love for his people. And again, it's not a perfect book, but I just love it so, so much. I feel like I connect to Kaya as a person, as a character. She feels so real to me, and her struggles are just so relatable, and I love this book so much. 5 stars. So, so happy I reread it, and I cannot wait to reread books 2 and 3 in the trilogy. Next up, we have Whose Waves These Are by Amanda Dykes, and I did only give this book 4 stars, but I still consider Amanda Dykes a favorite author. The emotions that this author brings out, they're just... She made me weep reading this book. Again, it is only 4 stars. I did have some issues with the character development and the plot, but it's still such an impactful story, and I don't want to say too much about the plot because I feel like this is one of those books where if you go in knowing very little, the emotional impact will be stronger. But I will say that it is dual timeline. It's partly set during World War II, but we don't have any scenes that are really set on a battlefield or anything like that. This is very much a character-driven story. If you don't like war stories, I still think this is worth a read because there's no military jargon, none of that. But like I said, it's dual timeline, partly World War II, partly 2001, I'm pretty sure. It is set in Maine, and it is very much a coastal lobster fishing town. It is so quaint, and I just loved the atmosphere of the book. But in the World War II timeline, we have a man named Bob who is grieving. He has lost someone because of the war, and he basically writes a poem. It has such a big impact on readers. It's in the newspapers. And then he also asks for people who have lost a loved one to send him a rock, and he wants to take all of these rocks and build something. And then in the present day, we have a girl named Annie, and she is Bob's grandniece. And so she comes to visit, and Bob is actually in hospital, he's ill, and she goes to his property and finds all these boxes of rocks and has no idea why all these boxes are full of rocks, what they're for. While Annie is visiting this town in Maine, she befriends the postman, and they basically start uncovering the story of Bob's life and the person that he lost and the war and all of that. Bob is very special to Annie because as a child she spent a summer with him, and she definitely has a very special place in her heart for Bob. And so figuring out what these rocks are for is very important to her, and figuring out basically Bob's life, his past, it's also very, very important to her. And it's just such a beautiful story. I loved this so much. It made me cry multiple times. The poem that Bob writes is also absolutely beautiful, and for a debut, I think this book is so good, and I just get absorbed in Amanda Dykes' storytelling. It's just beautiful. She's definitely a favorite for me, so very impactful book, and I would highly recommend. Next, we have a book that has a very high average on Goodreads, and I went in with very, very high expectations. Unfortunately, I only gave it 3.25 stars on Goodreads, but I think it was a good book. I just was kind of let down. And that is The Book of Lost Names by Kristen Harmel. The concept of this book was very interesting. We have our main character, Eva, who is basically tasked with forging documents. She has a talent for forging documents. Her father was taken prisoner during the Nazi invasion of Paris, and her mother have to flee. They are a Jewish family, and so they leave their home in Paris. They go to this small village, and Ava continues forging documents for the resistance. She also has to forge a lot of identity documents for children and give them new identities, and so she doesn't want these children to have their names completely erased from history. And so she starts this book of lost names where she records their true names, their true identities even though she's giving them false names, and these children basically have to start life over with new names. A lot of them have lost their parents, and it's just a very sad and heartbreaking circumstance. And so I love this altruistic side of our main character. She really cares for these children and does not want them to be completely forgotten in history. So although there were some emotional moments, and I did overall enjoy the, forging of identity documents aspect of this book, I did get a really strong sense of deja vu while reading it. It feels very much like other World War II historical fictions I've read. And it was to the point that I could predict what would happen. After each chapter, I was like, okay, this event just happened. I feel like this is going to happen next. It would happen. And there were some things that happened towards the end of the book that are meant to be like this, reveal and to make you shocked and angry. And while I was, very emotionally affected, I did see a lot of what came coming. I did see it coming. So it didn't feel very unique. I also found the love triangle very, very unnecessary. It really, really frustrated me, and I wasn't a fan of the romance. I just wasn't as captivated by this book as I was hoping to be, but it was not a terrible book. It just, 3 stars, middle of the road. All right, so now let's talk about the classics that I read in August. First, we have The Turn of the Screw and Other Ghost Stories. Oh Lord. This book, 1 star. It got 1 star. So I actually rated each individual story within this collection, and the highest rated story was 2 stars. I did not like the story, but I thought the setup was interesting. Every other story I found boring. The writing style was ridiculous. It was just run-on sentence after run-on sentence. Some of the stories had the most bizarre endings that made absolutely no sense to me. And I did leave The Turn of the Screw for last because I've heard good things about it, and I hated it so much. There was a little bit of build-up, and, I was kind of interested to keep reading, but the ending, obviously I won't spoil anything, but I just thought it was absolutely ridiculous. But I did not like this book. I did not like these short stories. I just didn't understand what the point was of any of them. So sorry if any of you like this book, but it got 1 star for me. This next classic is one that I was very hopeful for because I read another by this author earlier this year, and I think I gave it 4 or 5 stars. I don't quite remember, but I really enjoyed it. This one was the complete opposite for me. I did not enjoy it, and that is To a God Unknown by John Steinbeck. This book is odd. Our main character is basically trying to understand what God is, not necessarily who God is, but more like what he is, and looking at different ideas of God through a pagan lens, through a Judeo-Christian lens, and it was just odd. I didn't like the symbolism. I think it was kind of overkill at times. There's a lot of farming, and the main character moves to his own kind of farm in California. He leaves his father's house. His name is Joseph, and he's kind of like Joseph from the Bible. He's the father's favorite, and I think this book could have been interesting. I just didn't like what John Steinbeck did with the story, and it was too weird for me. Also, a very random and very unnecessary sex scene in the book that really ruined it for me because it had no place in this story at all. I was pretty disappointed. I did give it 2 stars. I do like John Steinbeck's writing style, but did not like this book. Next, we have a 4-star classic, and that is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. I finally read this book. Up until now, I had only read Oscar Wilde's plays, and I was so excited to read this book, and I was not disappointed. This was so good. Oscar Wilde had a way with words. He had a beautiful way of writing, and I'm so glad that I read this, and it's the perfect time of year to read it as well. Yeah, I'll say Oscar Wilde's writing is very straightforward, very accessible, but at the same time, there is a little bit of a flowery, beautiful twist to it, even though it's very straightforward at the same time. I don't quite know how to explain it, but I love it so much. So in this book, we have a man named Dorian who basically sells his soul to remain young forever and to be this beautiful, perfect person forever. And the story is basically following Dorian as he basically disintegrates. His morality and the choices that he makes just become more and more deplorable. His attitudes become awful. And While on the outside he stays young and beautiful, his inner soul is really not young and beautiful. It is a whole other story. He just becomes consumed by the desire for everything in his life to be this like decadent perfection. Meanwhile, his own soul is rotting. There is a painting in this book that plays a very important role in the story, and I love what Oscar Wilde did with that painting. Dorian also becomes heavily influenced by a man named Henry, and he is basically like the devil on the shoulder speaking in Dorian's ear. Henry is a malicious character. I could not stand him. But yeah, I don't want to say anything else because there isn't much you can say about the book without spoiling anything major. But I will say this book was wonderful. There were a couple parts that slogged just a little, and for such a short book, I did feel a little bit of, I guess, boredom maybe in the middle, where there was basically a whole chapter without a single word of dialogue. That was a little harder to get through, but besides that, I loved this book. The dialogue was so well written, and there were some really funny laugh out loud moments as well. So 4 stars, I highly recommend this book. Next, we have a book that I just finished a couple days ago, and I gave it 4.5 stars. It was fantastic, and that is Dracula by Bram Stoker. I don't know what I expected out of this book, but I did not expect it to love it as much as I did. This book just blew me away. I went into it with a similar attitude when I first read Frankenstein back in high school. I went into Frankenstein expecting it to be scary, and instead it made me cry. Same with this book. I went into it expecting all the spooky vibes. I expected to be like reading it at night, scared, looking around me, but I got emotional a lot more than I got spooked out by this book. There were definitely some unsettling scenes, but this book was just an emotional roller coaster. So our main character, Jonathan Harker, travels to Transylvania, and one thing I have to say is all the Romanian food references I loved seeing because I myself am Romanian. My parents were both born in Romania, and I just loved that part of this book was set in Romania. It just felt very close to home. I really enjoyed that aspect. But back to the plot. Jonathan Harker goes to Transylvania to meet Count Dracula at his castle, and he's basically there to help Dracula buy a house in England. While Jonathan is in the castle, some very creepy things start happening. He is very spooked out. And then back in England, his fiancée, Mina, she starts noticing some very odd occurrences, and her friend Lucy as well. We get a bunch of other characters come on the scene who play an important role in the story, and they were all so fascinating in their own way. And just the way that these characters interacted was so well written and explained, and I felt like I was there with them. Because all of these odd things are happening in England, and Jonathan has found out some things about Dracula in his castle, he sets on his journey to defeat Dracula. This book, like I said, was a roller coaster. It was so good. The entire book is actually told in diary form and letters, and it was such an effective way of telling the story. I really have come to love epistolary novels. This was just amazing. So good. 4.5 stars. I loved it. All right, on to the fantasy books that I read this month. First, we have The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. I finally read this brick, and I'm so glad that I did. I also gave this 4.5 stars, and I just loved it. I have no idea how to describe this story. I have no idea what to say about the plot. So I'm just gonna go with what is on Goodreads, and the exact same thing is also on the back of the book. I'm just gonna read that. I don't think you should know anything other than what is written on the back of the book before you read this. So it says, "My name is Kavoth. I have stolen princesses back from sleeping barrow kings. I burned down the town of Trebin. I have spent the night with Felurian and left with both my sanity and my life. I was expelled from the university at a younger age than most people are allowed in. I tread paths by moonlight that others fear to speak of during day. I have talked to gods, loved women, and written songs that make the minstrels weep. You may have heard of me." So begins a tale unequaled in fantasy, the story of a hero told in his own voice. It is a tale of sorrow, a tale of survival, a tale of one man's search for meaning in his universe, and how that search and the indomitable will that drove it gave birth to a legend. That is all I'm going to say about the book itself, like the story aspect. I will say Kvoth as a character is fascinating. I really loved him as a character. This is a very character-driven book. There isn't a whole lot of plot, but I just think it was so captivating that I didn't need a fast-moving plot for me to just be sucked up by this story, and I loved it so much. There are some aspects of the book that kind of reminded me of Assassin's Apprentice. It's very different than Assassin's Apprentice, but I just feel like maybe the tone of the book felt similar. I didn't like Assassin's Apprentice as much as I liked this book, but I just thought there was a bit of a similarity, but that may be more like my experience. Other readers of both books may have had a different experience. This book had European medieval vibes, which I really enjoyed, and it's also set during fall, which was great. The reason I didn't give it 5 stars is just because I struggled a bit with the history of the world and the gods and goddesses. I feel like the world building was lacking, but that obviously has to do with the fact that this is not a standalone. There's another book. I just felt like I didn't know enough about the world. I didn't know enough about the world's history, and so I felt like I was missing out on something. Other than that, this was fantastic. Such a good fantasy, and I'm so happy that I read it. I loved it. I totally thought that I read another fantasy this month, but that was actually the only one. So now we'll go on to mystery. First, we have Her Royal Spyness by Rhys Bowen. This is the first in the Her Royal Spyness mystery series. This was so fun. I gave it 3.5 stars. It is exactly what I expected. The perfect cozy mystery. Not much of substance, but just fun. So our main character, her name is Lady Victoria Georgiana Charlotte Eugenie. She's 34th in line to the throne, and basically she is broke. Her brother refuses to pay her allowance anymore because he's struggling financially. It's also the Great Depression, and a lot of people in Great Britain were struggling during the 30s. It wasn't a great time for a lot of people, even people in the royal family. And so in this book, Georgie, as she's called, she is basically tasked by the Queen Mary, to spy on Wallis Simpson, who was getting to know Edward. And if you know anything about that history, a lot went down. So that is one aspect of the story. Then we have a murder victim show up in her brother's bathtub, and so she's trying to figure out what on earth happened there, and it's just pure fun. Like, for its entertainment value, it was perfect. Georgie also tries to work as a housekeeper in disguise, and she knows nothing about housekeeping, so that was absolutely hilarious. She also has a best friend named Belinda who cracked me up. Belinda was just hilarious. I couldn't. Anytime she was on the scene, I was cracking up. I will say the mystery itself wasn't anything crazy. I basically guessed the perpetrator, and there were a couple conversations centered around sex that I could have done without. Very unnecessary, but overall, 3.5 stars. I think this book was so fun, and I cannot wait to read more in this series. Next, we have His Last Bow by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and this is the second last short story collection in the Sherlock Holmes series. Unfortunately, this is now my least favorite out of all the Sherlock Holmes, I guess, canon. I gave this one 3 stars. I didn't like all of the short stories, to be completely honest, but my 2 favorite were The Adventure of the Dying Detective and The Adventure of the Devil's Foot. The Adventure of the Devil's Foot was set in Cornwall, and I love anything set in Cornwall. It felt very spooky and eerie and autumnal. And yeah, those are the 2 that I really enjoyed. Other than that, they were mediocre in my opinion, but I have one more short story collection and then I'm completely done the Sherlock Holmes canon, and I can't believe it. But yeah, this one only got 3 stars for me, unfortunately. I also read Lock Every Door by Riley Sager, and this also only got 3 stars for me. It wasn't terrible, but it was quite a slow start for me, and I did guess what was happening. So our main character ends up taking this job as an apartment sitter in this very affluent apartment complex, and she's paid a lot of money to apartment sit, and she's basically questioning, like, are there any strings attached? Because this is crazy to make this much money just to sit and live in an apartment. But then our main character starts noticing that the apartment complex, the Bartholomew, is not as it seems. One of the residents goes missing, and then the mystery kind of ensues from there. I personally figured out what was going on. I thought it was pretty obvious, and I think we were kind of handed the evidence like on a silver platter. I didn't feel like there was enough subtlety. I do prefer Home Before Dark over this one, but it was fun. Lately, the Agatha Christie books that I've been reading, I haven't been giving very high ratings to. Part of that is because the books that are most beloved, I'm trying to save them for last. I am reading through all of Agatha Christie's books, and I want to get through as many of the lower rated ones as possible. But I finally read one that I gave 4 stars to, and I really enjoyed this one, and that is A Pocket Full of Rye. This is the book that I mentioned when I was talking about the nursery rhymes. Basically, the entire nursery rhyme is laid out in this book as the mystery, and that was just really fun to see. Like usual, I'm not going to say what this book is about because I feel like a lot of people like going into Agatha Christie blind, but it was very well written, and I think the mystery was very well laid out. The characters were very interesting, and the detective that works on the case, besides Miss Marple helping out, he was a very interesting detective as well. I don't think he was in any other Miss Marple book that I've read. I was very wrong with all of my guesses, and I was wrong up until the very end, the last reveal. It was just so much fun and I really, really enjoyed it. Finally, we have a book that I just finished last night, and that is The Haunting at Bonaventure Circus by Jamie Jo Wright. I gave this 4.5 stars. It was almost a 5-star, but I struggled through the first third of the book. It was a little slow moving for my taste, but it was just so well written, so beautiful. So this is a dual timeline mystery. First, we have a female protagonist in the 1920s. Her name is Pippa, and her father basically owns the Bonaventure Circus. Pippa was actually born to parents within the circus. She doesn't know who they are though, because they left her on her adoptive father's doorstep. And so she grew up in this house knowing that she wasn't their biological daughter, knowing that her biological parents were from the circus, but she just never knew their identities. That has always been kept from her. Pippa is getting these very mysterious messages from someone known as the Watchman, and he always has his face covered, so she doesn't know who he is, what he looks like, but she feels this connection to him, and she doesn't quite know if he is her father or if he is someone else. There's just something very mysterious about him. Pippa also starts helping out with this baby elephant who was rejected by her birth mother, and she's very injured, she's not eating, and Pippa is basically the only person who the elephant seems to trust. This baby elephant was so precious, it broke my heart. Elephants are my favorite animal. I couldn't. Oh my goodness. But this elephant named Lily, Pippa works so hard to nurse her back to health, and she gets to know this man who works in the circus named Jake, and he has so much anger in him. He's still grieving the death of his sister. She was actually murdered, so he's trying to seek retribution for her murder, and Pippa's just getting caught up in his issues. And there are a lot of protests happening from people who are animal rights activists, and they are against the circus, and it's just this whole situation. There are also rumors of a serial killer in the circus, and Pippa's worried that she's basically, making herself an easy target. And then in our modern day, we have a main character named Chandler who has recently moved to the city more like small town, that the Bonaventure Circus was in. And again, it's modern day, so the circus is not a circus anymore, but it's kind of like a museum. And the old circus train depot is basically being remodeled, and Chandler starts going into the depot's history, into the circus's history, and she starts learning about the circus in the past and all the murders that were occurring, and she gets to know a little bit about Pippa and her family, and she starts finding clues to what had happened to many women back in the 1920s. And this book, so good. I just think that it was so layered, but so well done and explained so well. And the last few chapters, I was on the edge of my seat. I loved it. It kept hopping back from Pippa figuring things out and then Chandler figuring out what Pippa had already been, figuring out and everything. And wow, it was just very intense, very, very good. And it had a baby elephant in it, and I can't get over the baby elephant. She was precious. I loved this. This book was so good. But yeah, I finished it last night, so it's fresh, and I'm still reeling from it, but very, very good book. This is one of my favorites by Jamie Jo Wright so far. I loved it so much, would highly recommend. All right, everyone, that is it for my August wrap up part 2. I hope you guys enjoyed. I know it was a very long video with lots of books to talk about, but hopefully you were able to bounce around from different genres if there were some genres you're not interested in. If you've read any of these books, please let me know what your thoughts were. And I'd like to know your favorite and least favorite book from August. If you don't have a channel, if you're not going to be filming a wrap up, please let me know what your favorite and least favorite reads were from this month. So that is it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I appreciate each of you guys for taking time out of your day to watch me ramble because I do a lot of rambling. But again, I appreciate it so much, and I hope to see you all in my next one. Bye.